NextJS 13 was released about 2 weeks ago, and in this video we're going to look at the new features, the app directory, the nested layouts, the server components, the breaking changes that you need to be aware of if you're migrating from NextJS 12 to 13, and more. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamid. I'm a full-stack JavaScript developer, and here on this channel we talk all about modern web dev topics like NextJS and React. Let's get into this. We're going to learn the new NextJS 13 features by building this simple app here, where you have some shared layout between all of your pages, this top navigation and a footer. Then we have this user section, which has this side panel, which is again shared between all the child components. And if you click on a specific user, you would then see that user's information, all of which is with the new app directory, using server components and fetching data on the server side. But before getting into building this app together, let's look at the features of NextJS 13 from a high level. If you come to Next.js.org, there is this release or blog post that the team put together talking about different kind of features in NextJS 13, including the app directory. This is the new way of creating pages and routes in your application, the concept of layouts and shared layouts, and also nested layouts throughout your kind of routes, the React server components, and how by default any component you put in this new app directory is going to be a React server component, streaming, TurboPack, which is a Rust-based Webpack replacement, the new next image, the new next link, and next font, some of which are still in beta. But what you need to be aware of if you're migrating from Next.js 12 to 13 is if you type in breaking changes over here, you can see the minimum React version has been bumped to 18. Similarly for Node, you have to change the Node version. This SWC minify has changed from false to true. So by default, it's going to be true. I found some packages that throw errors when this is true, and I had to manually turn them back to false. So not exactly sure about that, but something to be aware of. The next image is now stable, meaning that if you're using the new next image, you no longer have to import it from next future image. From this point on, or from the NextJS 13 on, the new version is just going to be the default next image, and the previous version of the next image is going to be next legacy image. So you have to go into your app and change the imports, plus that there is some API changes in the images and how you would style them and how you would define layouts for your images that you could read through the documentation, or you can run this script, this code mod, to change the imports and use the new API in your code. Similarly, the next link has changed. You no longer have to put in an A tag in your next links. It just comes in with the anchor tag. Again, there is a script for you to run if you wanted to kind of migrate a bigger app instead of updating the links one by one. The routers no longer prefetch the user agent. If the user agent is a bot, it's not going to prefetch different routes through the links. And the rest is nothing to worry about for concerning a breaking change. If you're supporting older browsers, yeah, you could just read through this too. So mainly it's React version, Node version, next image, and next link. The new app directory is still experimental. As you can see here, it's in beta version. It's not stable, so you can definitely migrate to Next.js 13 and then incrementally adopt to this new app directory for new pages or some of your pages as it's becoming more stable. So let's see how we can go about building this app that we have over here. You can go to this new documentation that the team has. It's beta.nextjs.org docs. This is primarily for the NextJS 13 and the new app directory. I found it to be very useful if you wanted to kind of wrap the new concept around your head and understand how things are working in this new kind of setting. And here we're going to just follow some of the steps over here and then to build this app together. I'm going to use pnpm to create this next app. All you need to run is create a next app at latest and then pass in this flag experimental app. So let me just create the npx since I've always used that. So here, I'm just going to create a new next app, and I pass in this new flag, which is the experimental app. It asks me if I want to use TypeScript. No, for the purposes of this tutorial. You could choose yes if you want to build with TypeScript. So while this is getting installed, I'm going to also go to Tailwind CSS because that's what I'm going to be using for styling the components. If you head out to docs and to framework guides, you can see there's this guide to kind of install NextJS and then Tailwind CSS and its dependencies. So let's run that script too. And we're going to kind of initialize this as well, which creates our Tailwind config, which we can go modify. And the only thing different from before is that now you're asking, or you're putting in your Tailwind config this new app directory. It's interesting that they've updated their documentation so fast to include this app if you're also using the new experimental app feature. And then the way that the new Next.js kind of styling works is that in the app directory, instead of the pages and the styles directory, you have this global CSS, which I'm going to replace. I'm going to explain the content of this app directory in a second after we're kind of done here. So let me just close that off. So as you can see here, we still have this pages directory mainly for our API routes. If we go to /API and hello, we're still going to get this data. So for APIs, we're still using the pages directory. It may change in future, but for now, for the API, we're using that. But for our pages or our routes or the paths that the user can visit, we're going to use this new app directory. And for pages in our app, we're going to put in directories and files in this app folder. So this page.jsx is pointing to our home route. And then we're going to have this, let me just get rid of this CSS modules because we're now using it. We have this layout, which is our shared layout. So you can think of this as a combination of the _app.js and the _document.js, where _app was where you could access the component that was just rendering every page based on the router. And then in the _document, in the previous version or the old version of Next.js or Next.js 12, you would just have the _document where you would have these HTML tags and the head and the body, which was rendering kind of our app. The way that it works now is you have this layout, which is the shared layout of your app, having an HTML tag, a head tag, which looks for the closest head.jsx and points that or imports that into this layout. You can have multiple of these, and that's why we're using the fragments, because you can add multiple of those and then they will be merged in together into this head tag in your kind of document. You have this children, which is any page that you would render would be plugged into this body tag, and this is going to be acting as the root layout of our site. So if you want to create a new page, the way we used to do it in Next.js 12 was in the pages directory, you could have just had a new directory called about, and then inside of it, you would put in an index.jsx, and then this would have become your about page. And by the way, this still works because as long as there's no conflict with the pages that you're creating in the pages directory and the app directory, it still works together. But they're kind of two separate apps. As you can see, my about page is now rendered from the pages, but Tailwind CSS is not applied to it because we haven't imported Tailwind CSS in any styles there. But as an example of how we create new pages in the Next.js 12, it's kind of the similar approach in app.js, where you would just create a new directory, And then inside of it, instead of index.js, you create a page.jsx. So same concept, different naming conventions. And this is going to be my new about. Let me just get rid of this so that I don't have any conflicts. And then now if I save this and go to the about page, I should get this new about page, which is rendering from the app directory, and styles are applied because this is now imported into this layout where our global CSS, which is reading Tailwind or resetting our styles with Tailwind, is actually in action. Okay, so this is the way that we create new pages that we learned about that. Now let's go about creating this layout that we want to create. Let me just open up that app that we had in the beginning so that we can kind of replicate what we have over there. So as you can see here in this app that we created before, we have this shared kind of layout or navigation on top and this footer at the bottom. So how do we go about creating that? Well, this layout is our root layout and holds anything that is shared between all of our pages. So this is a good place for us to put in that. So let's create a header component.jsx. And you can just go ahead and create components or co-locate your components with your routes in this new version. You can create a new separate directory for your components, just as we were doing it in NextJS 12. But for components that are mainly used in this route, I found it easier to just co-locate my components with the rest of the files, because NextJS 13 or the engine doesn't care about these. It just looks at the files that are specifically named page, layout, header, error, loading, so forth and so on. But you can just put in your components over here. And to just speed this up, let me just copy the components that I have from there, so you're not going to watch me recreate this. So in our header component, I'm just rendering a header tag, putting in some links, and notice that my links no longer have that extra anchor tag inside of them because this is now the new version of the next link. And nothing crazy. Let me also create a footer component that we're going to be using in our layout. So in the footer, again, nothing crazy. We're just rendering some footer. Now let's import these guys into our layout. So I'm going to import footer, from /footer, and I'm going to also import, header from /header, and then let's come in here and put our header over here and the footer over here, and maybe we're going to also wrap all of our main content in a main tag. So let's go back to our own app. I'm going to close that. So this is what we are trying to kind of build together. And I've added some basic styles to my global CSS to make this kind of span the full width of the screen. If I can copy my styles over here. Okay, so what I'm doing here is mainly full edge of 100% for HTML body and making the body a flex, and this content of the main tag, which holds this children, to be flex one, which just grows. So therefore the kind of our footer is down in the bottom, even if our content is not kind of tall enough. So basic things, section that applies some paddings, and a class of center, which just if applied to any container, just centers that container. So nothing crazy, just some basic styles using the base layer in Tailwind CSS. Okay, so we have this starter for our page. Let me just replace this with something that's bigger and nicer. So as you can see here, we have our page, we have our layout, we have our header and footer, and some head tags, which is just the content of the head tag in our document. If I go back to the already built page, the user would then have this kind of nested layout where we have this side panel that persists even though these components change. And when we click on different users, we're going to see different users. So 3 different components are rendering over here, but we're just persisting that top navigation and this side navigation, which is the concept of nested layouts in the new app directory. So how do we go about doing that? Why don't we start from integrating Prisma and database to our application so that we can fetch our users, and then we would go ahead about creating the nested layout. Prisma is a modern ORM, and ORM is an object relational mapping, which simply is a way to communicate with your database. So instead of writing your queries in SQL language, if you're using a SQL kind of database, you would use the Prisma API to define your schemas and query your database, create a connection and query your database. Similarly, if you're using MongoDB as your database, instead of writing your queries in MQL or MongoDB query language, you would use, again, Prisma API to communicate and query your data from MongoDB. So the first thing that we would do is we need to install Prisma. So let me just go ahead and npmi-d Prisma. Once we install this package as a dev dependency, we have to initialize Prisma, which is going to create some files for us so we can work with it. So to initialize Prisma, all you need to do is run npx prisma init. And this does 2 things. It creates this Prisma directory in our project where you could see this schema.prisma. And this is where we can put our models and also our connection strings. And it also creates this .env automatically for you, where you can put in your database connection string. And in our case, instead of a Postgres, we're going to use our MongoDB connection string to connect to our own database in MongoDB. So you can put in your connection string over here. And what happens is in this schema.prisma, we are using the Prisma client.js, and we would just turn our provider to be a MongoDB. And this database URL is pointing to that environment variable. So you just need to change the string over here, and this just reads it, reads the connection when it wants to create a Prisma client. So let me just go ahead and pause the video and copy my connection string, and I'll be back. Okay, so I've copied over my connection string, and now we can move to the next step, which is connecting our database. We already did copy this database URL, which explains how it works for MongoDB specifically, and that when you create a new cluster, you can get this connection string from your cluster, and you would then plug in your username over here and password to be able to connect to that specific instance of MongoDB. But once you have that done, you can create your Prisma schema, which is the models existing in your database, or you intend to create in your database. It will be tables in a SQL-based database and collections in MongoDB specifically. So for this reason, I'm going to create copy over what I've created over here. It's just a sample model for our users. So let me just copy over here. So I'm saying I have a user collection, and in this user collection, I'm going to have ID, which is going to be a string. For MongoDB specifically, we're going to have a type of object ID which is named _ID. So that's why we're mapping it to this ID and we're using it as a string version versus the object ID. I'm going to have email for each user, which is going to be unique and a string, name maybe optional, image URL, string and optional. So this is the model that I have over here. It also explains here how MongoDB _ID is a bit different, and that's why we have these kind of settings over there. Now that we have our model created, we would generate our Prisma client, which is a specific version or tailored version of the Prisma client that kind of works with our models. So to do this, first we would install the Prisma client. So let me just go ahead and install the Prisma client. And once you install this for the first time, it also invokes Prisma generate, which looks at your Prisma schema and then creates this relationships or the tailored client to work with the model that you created. But anytime after this, if you change your schemas, you have to manually run Prisma generate every time that you're changing the schema.prisma file. But the first time that you're installing it, it just does it automatically, so we don't need to run it again. So let's run the dev server again. Now that we have our Prisma client, we can start querying our database. Now our database right now doesn't have anything inside of it. So why don't we create some methods that we can actually write to our database, create some users, and then read from it. Now in this example over here on the right hand side, it talks about creating this file that you can run from Node.js to connect to your database, to read from it and write to it and then disconnect. For now, we're not going to use that. It shows you how to run a query against your database with this find many. But again, we don't have any data there, so we won't do that for now. But what I want to do is to show you how you would go about implementing Prisma in your NextJS app. So typically what I like to do is I will create a lib folder inside my app, and inside of it another folder I will call Prisma, and maybe we can have another folder here for our utility functions. In the Prisma I would have an index.js, which is where I would initialize my Prisma client from the package that we just downloaded. So this Prisma client is what we generated that works. It's a Prisma client that's tailored to our models. I'm going to create a new Prisma client and export it from here so that I can use this Prisma whenever I want to run a query against my database. And I'm going to create a specific file for my users model. So I'm going to have another file for users. And here I want to write specific functions that allow me to create a user, get a user by ID, or get many users, so forth and so on. So for this, again, I'm going to copy this to speed up, but I'm going to explain what we're doing here. So to get all the users, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import this Prisma client that I just created over here. So I have this Prisma client. I'm going to run this query, prisma.user. Now, this is how Prisma client has been kind of generated or customized to my models. It has a user model now on it because I said so in my kind of Prisma schema. And then find many is how you can get a lot of users from Prisma. And the good thing is when you're working with ORMs or Prisma, in this case, you no longer have to know, again, as I mentioned, the specific query language for that database. You just learn Prisma API once, and no matter what database you're connecting to, the API is always going to be the same thing. So find many, it just gives me many users. If there are users, I'm returning them. If an error happens, I'm returning this error. To create a user, again, let me just close this off. I'm using prisma.user.create. I'm expecting some user data to be passed to me, and then I will create a user based on that data by passing a data object to this create method. And I'm going to return that user. This method actually returns the newly created user from the database, and I'm going to return it to whoever is calling this kind of function. And get user by ID, it's going to find a unique user where ID is this ID that we sent here. So very basic queries from our database to create a user, to get a user by ID, or get many users, which we're going to use in our application. So the first place that we could use this is in an API, because right now I don't have any users. And how can I create new users? Well, one way to create new users is just to go directly in your MongoDB database and create some users there. You can do that. And for that, I would recommend using MongoDB Compass. Let me just open it up over here so I can show it to you. So MongoDB Compass is a way for you to kind of interact with your databases in MongoDB. I love it because you could run aggregations from it. You see all your databases, collections, and then it's way faster than going to MongoDB site and then logging in and then going to your cluster and then going to your collection. It's just way faster. So one way is to create a database over here, create a user collection inside of it, and start putting in some users. But in this example, because I want to use these functions that we created, I'm going to do that through an API. So we're going to expose an API from NextJS API routes. And with Postman, I'm going to just post new users to that API endpoint, and we're going to use that data. So we just close this off. Okay, so let's go to our APIs and create some APIs that uses these functions. So for APIs, we're going to still use the previous page directory. In the API, I'm going to create a new users folder, and inside of this users folder, I'm going to create an index.js. Instead of creating this, I'm going to explain what's going on over here. As you can see, I have a handler. Again, I'm exporting this handler. This is the regular API routes for Next.js. And I'm expecting two methods, either get or a post. If you're getting users, meaning that you want to get a lot of users, so it would be /API/users, and that's index.js inside the users folder in the API, kind of mapping to that endpoint. I'm going to call the get user function from this file that we just created to get users from our Prisma. And then you can see up here, it says @lib Prisma users. And the way that I am prefixing this with @sign, if you don't know it, you can put in a JS config file over here, which I don't have. So this might not work. Let me just copy this over. Good thing that I mentioned it. So JS config.json. You can then just create some mappings. So instead of having to go like ... you just go @sign, and it gets to kind of whatever file you're trying to access. So in our lib folder in our Prisma, we created these users that exposed these different functions that allows us to kind of query our database. And I'm using the get users over here, and I'm just passing it as JSON. If there's any error, I'm passing the error. Similarly, if you send a post request to this endpoint, you have to specify or provide some data in the body of your post request. That would be the user data, their name, email, image, URL, stuff like that. It would then call the create user from our kind of query over here to create a new user in our MongoDB, and then returns that user to you, or if there is any error. And I'm not expecting for you to send any other kind of type of request to this endpoint. So if there's anything else, I'll just respond with the 425 response. Okay, so this is the first thing that we have over here. So let's create this. Let's test this endpoint with sending some data from Postman. Let me just open this up so you guys can see it. Okay, so this is as big as I can make it happen. I hope you're seeing it correctly. But so what we're doing over here is that we are sending a post request to the endpoint that be users, and we're going to have in our body, it's not showing me. Okay, here. I hope it's not very small. So I've selected the raw and then the JSON. This allows me to pass in some JSON data. I'm going to create a user for myself, and then this is going to have an email field. And for the image URL, I'm going to use GitHub images. And if you didn't know it, if you go to GitHub and kind of go to your username.png, you can get your image. github.com/Hamid Bahram.png. Hopefully this works. It's API /users. So if I send this, I should be able to just create a user and then getting a user object back from MongoDB, which creates this _ IDs automatically. Now we have this Prisma database. Inside of it, there's this user collection, and now this newly created user is just living there. So let me just pause the video, create 2 more users, and then we'll continue. Okay, I went ahead and created 2 more users from the Vercel team. So let me just close this off and fetch these users now on our application. So up until now, just to kind of summarize what we have done, is that we have created these API routes for the users and to be able to get users and create users so we can interact with our database from the API. Right now, we are not doing anything magical for the app directory yet, but now we have some data that we can fetch. So let's close this off and then close that off as well. Okay, so what do we do next? If we look at our application, which is this guy, let me close this off. So when we currently go to the user, there's nothing there. So there's going to be a 404 because we don't have this users kind of folder or page created. So that's the first thing we should maybe do. Let's create a new folder over here with the users, and we're going to put a page.jsx inside of it. Okay, so that is going to hold, our users kind of component. So we just again copy what I have over here. So right now we have this simple kind of users page that says select a user. Now the idea is for our users or any page from this point on, we want to have a nested layout. And the nested layout, the way that it should work or look is the same thing that we kind of showed in this example in the beginning, where you would have this now site navigation instead of the kind of header, this site navigation to persist throughout our app, no matter what user we're selecting over here. So to create this functionality over here, we can use a nested layout, which is just another layout inside of this users folder. So each of these folders that you put in your app directory will become a route of your application, and inside of them there's this specific files you can put in, like page, like layout, that would apply to the page component, to the layout component that's kind of shared between any child component from that point on in your kind of route. So here I'm going to create this new layout, which is going to be a nested layout for anything that's inside of this users and onwards. And again, let me just copy this layout that I have created. So in this user layout, all I'm doing is getting the children. These are going to be the components that we can slot inside this main element over here. And I'm having this section over here, which is going to be including this sidebar aside that just shows a list of our users. For this users, I'm just using a regular component. So I'm going to, again, co-locate my component over here. So users.jsx is going to hold my users. And here's now where the fun begins. Let me just save this and this. We just close everything so I can explain to you what's going on. So in the users, what we've done so far is we had this page to begin with. We had this layout, which is a shared layout. This is just sidebar, which is supposed to just show a list of different users. And this page that we already have just says a select user. So when you are at users, so you're at the index of that route, it just shows this component which says select a user. And the idea is when we select on each of these guys, we want to then go inside those specific users and have a dynamic route fetching the data to that specific user and show it here, which will be plugged in inside of this children or slot or placeholder for anything that now is inside of the users folder is going to use this shared layout, and it's going to be just plugged inside this kind of slot that we have over here for children. Now in the users component, as you can see over here, it's where the magic is happening. Now inside of this user, I am using that same get users function that we wrote that was using the Prisma client to fetch our database, which up until now was running on the server side in our API routes, and again is still running on the server side because this users component is a React server component. So I mentioned in the beginning that any component you put inside of the app folder is going to be by default a React server component. So this is running on the server. That's why I'm able to safely access my database, because you don't want to expose your database credentials to the client side. It's only safe to do it on the server side. And because by default, these are all server components, I'm able to just call the same function that I was calling inside my APIs. This is the same function that I was running in my API handler inside of my React components now to get the users and then map over these users, and for each one just render a link. So right now when I click on this user, it doesn't result in anything because we don't have a dynamic route capturing this specific user to show it. So let's create that route next. Similar to how we would do it before with NextJS, for a dynamic route, you would just create a new dynamic folder over here. I'm going to name it user ID, and inside of it, guess what? We're going to have a page.jsx, which represents the page component for this dynamic path. So let me just copy over what I have over here again to save some time. So inside of this page component, I'm rendering this user. Let me just create this user component, and I'm going to explain what we're doing over here. Okay, so inside of this user ID dynamic route, we have this page component which represents again the index kind of page or route for that folder, and then I have this user component which just showing the user details such as their image and their name and their email. So again, what we're doing here is inside this page component that represents a specific user in a dynamic route, we are getting the dynamic parameters from the URL. So this is exposed to this page component, and from that dynamic parameter we're getting the user ID, because this is what we defined over here. Similar concept as to Next.js 12 and what we would have done inside our pages directory. You would have had to access this in your get server-side props or get static props functions, but right now you can just access it over here easily. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that now with React Server components, you can turn them into async functions. That's why I was able to evade calling these database functions, which are asynchronous tasks. So we're passing that specific ID to get user by ID, and this is a function we created before, if you remember. Let me close this off, which was getting an ID and running a query against our Prisma user collection to find a unique user where ID is this ID that we passed in. So this is what we already defined before. Right now, we're just getting the parameters from the dynamic path of our route, passing that ID to get user by ID, get the user, and send it to this user component. Again, this user component just gets that user and displays information about that user. Now let's go back to this error that we were seeing here. So if I select a user, I would see this error because I'm using images from GitHub and I haven't added this to my config. So if you go to your to this error that comes in, it says when you're using images from an outside source, you have to kind of add this to your next config and tell it where you're fetching images from. In this case, sorry, if you go back in that error, it tells you, hey, add this guy, which is GitHub, where I'm fetching the images from, to your Next.js config. Save it, and anytime that you're running or you're changing your next config, you have to restart your dev server to pick up on those kind of specific changes. So I'm going to go back to users. So now we're seeing our users again, and if I click on a specific user, I should be able to see the information from them. I included Lee Rob, the head of developer advocate at Vercel, and Guillermo, the guy himself, to the team over here. So as you can see, we can easily have shared layouts in our app directory. We can have nested layouts where we had this general layout for our header and footer, and then we had this specific layout for our users. Maybe you have a specific layout for your profile page, a specific layout for your search page, or whatever kind of is relevant to your application. You can kind of nest these things together. The other thing that we covered today was React Server Components and how easily you can just turn them into async functions to then fetch data, like this example here, whether you're fetching a list of the users or you're fetching a specific user. We were able to do it right here from our component. And this is something that we would have done previously in a get static props or get server side props in Next.js, but right now it's just done without any Next.js specific kind of API. It's just JavaScript and functions that we're calling. It's just that our components by default are now React Server components, and it allows us to make them async functions and run these queries on the server side alongside our components. Another benefit to using these nested layouts is for this specific page, the only thing that re-renders is this part over here. The header, the footer, and also this kind of shared layout for our users are not changing. So we are not refetching data for that sidebar. We're not refetching data for the header and footer. That reduces the number of requests that we need to send to kind of render different pages. And the only thing changing is this component or child component over here. Whereas if you would have just created this in Next.js 12 for this sidebar, you needed to fetch data for this sidebar, and you needed to have this kind of shared layout for your users layout repeating in each of these child components, whereby you would have still needed to fetch data for these layouts. So you would have fetched unnecessarily more than you needed, because you're just getting the same data. But because when the page changes and I go to a different user, this whole thing re-renders. In that case, well, you could have just persisted the header and footer, but this whole shared layout or the nested layout would have had to re-render, and we would have just unnecessarily refetched this same list over and over again. So it's more optimized in the sense that the only thing that I'm fetching right now or changing when I change routes or go to a different user is just this user specific information and not the list over and over again. That's it for this video, folks. I hope you learned something in this video. If you had any questions, put them in the comments. The app directory still is in beta, but it is good to get yourself familiar with where Next.js is headed if this is a framework of your choice. And as things become stable, I'll create more and more content explaining how we would do things in Next.js 13 and how they're different with the way we are currently doing it in Next.js 12. So see you in the next one. Bye-bye.